Hollywood has led us to believe that a berserker is just a really angry guy with an axe. He gnaws on his shield, growls at the moon, and charges into battle without any strategy. It sounds incredibly cool for the movies, but it's absolutely useless in a real battle of shields. No commander in their right mind would put an uncontrollable psychopath on the front line. The true story of these warriors is far more complex and terrifying than any Hollywood fairy tale. These men weren't born as ruthless killing machines. They became them as a result of a brutal training program that broke most of the candidates. Today, we call such methods extreme psychological torture. The Norse, however, considered it the sacred path of the bear or the wolf. Modern special forces use similar principles to select the best of the best. Only the Vikings had no psychologists ready to stop the experiment. Many people think that the biggest and most muscular men in the village were chosen to be berserkers. This seems quite logical for the heavy infantry of antiquity. But this is where the most interesting divergence between myth and harsh reality begins. Huge muscles require a massive amount of calories to function. Under conditions of long sea voyages and food shortages, such giants simply became a burden. Therefore, they weren't looking for mountains of muscle, but for people with a specific type of nervous system. A candidate had to possess the ability to instantly switch from a state of calm to extreme aggression. Modern science calls this high nervous system lability. Endurance can be trained, but an innate type of stress response is nearly impossible to change. Future berserkers were identified as early as adolescence based on their behavior in critical situations, and after that, their lives ceased to be normal forever. The candidate was literally removed from his familiar social environment and normal society. Why was it necessary to do this at such a young age? And to destroy his former identity and attachment to peaceful life. If you want to create a person who isn't afraid of death, you must deprive them of what makes life worth living. Your comfortable office job may seem difficult, but try to imagine such a career change. The initiation process always began with complete isolation from human society. A teenager was sent deep into the forest or the mountains for several months. He had to survive alone, carrying only the most basic set of tools. This wasn't a weekend camping trip with marshmallows. It was a deadly game of survival in the harsh Scandinavian climate. Most modern people would break down on the third night in such a forest. Isolation does truly terrifying things to the human brain. Without social contact, our psyche begins to actively dismantle familiar patterns of behavior. After a few weeks of solitude, a person begins to lose the boundary between themselves and the surrounding world of wild nature. The northern shamans understood this mechanism perfectly long before the advent of modern psychiatry. They used solitude as a hammer to shatter the old personality of the future warrior. But solitude alone was not enough to create a legendary warrior. Isolation was always accompanied by controlled starvation. Food in the forest during winter was catastrophically scarce, and the candidate was constantly undernourished. Modern nutritionists would faint at the sight of such a diet. However, the constant feeling of hunger sharpened all the senses to an animalistic level. The body switched to extreme survival mode, pumping horse-sized doses of adrenaline into the bloodstream. It was precisely at this moment that the young man's primary psychological transformation took place. Exhausted by hunger and cold, the brain began to hallucinate and seek new points of reference. The young man was led to believe that at that moment, the spirit of a wild beast was entering him. He stopped identifying himself as a weak, freezing human being. Instead, he began to sincerely believe that he had become a bear or a wolf. Sounds like pure madness, doesn't it? But let's look at this from the perspective of modern neurobiology. When the brain is on the verge of exhaustion, it is easily susceptible to powerful self-suggestion. Creating a new, animalistic sub-personality protected the psyche from complete collapse. It was a kind of safety valve that allowed one to survive unbearable suffering. The Romans turned legionnaires into cogs in a machine, while the Vikings turned people into predators. To complete this stage, the young man had to kill a large predator. He had to do this alone, with a minimal amount of weapons. Many candidates simply did not return from the forest, and their names were forgotten. But those who survived returned to the settlement as completely different beings. The look in these young men's eyes frightened even seasoned warriors with dozens of campaigns under their belts. Now, standing before the community was not a boy, but a member of the Brotherhood who had undergone initiation. But this was merely the psychological foundation for moving forward. Convincing yourself that you are a bear is only half the battle. You still had to teach your human body to function beyond its physical limits. And this is where the physical training began, the kind that would make modern athletes weep. Welcome to a real Scandinavian training camp. The second phase of training broke the body just as mercilessly as isolation broke the mind. A berserker had to completely ignore physical pain in the heat of battle. How do you teach a person to ignore cuts and lacerations? The only way is to make pain a constant, familiar companion in life. Modern trainers use massage rollers for toughening up, while the Vikings used clubs. Future warriors were regularly subjected to brutal beatings during training sparring sessions. They were struck with blunt weapons until their bodies were covered in a solid blanket of bruises. The human brain is wired such that, under constant exposure to pain, the pain threshold steadily rises. After several months of this practice, blows that would have knocked an ordinary person unconscious were perceived as mere mild discomfort. The nervous system simply stopped sending panic signals to the brain. This is pure physiological adaptation, working flawlessly. Now imagine a warrior who feels no pain from a spear strike. In ancient battles, the shock of a wound often killed faster than blood loss. An ordinary warrior, upon seeing his own blood, would panic and lower his shield. A berserker, however, upon receiving a wound, would only experience an additional surge of aggression and adrenaline. To his enemies, it looked like magic, but it was merely rigorous training. In addition to sparring, warriors practiced prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. They stood for hours in the icy waters of the fjords, controlling their breathing and heart rate. Today, we admire Wim Hof's method and pay huge sums of money for it at seminars. The Norse did this for free and with much higher stakes. Anyone who couldn't warm themselves with an inner fire simply died of hypothermia. The cold was their strictest and most impartial examiner. Why was this torture of their own bodies necessary? The Viking sea voyages took place in conditions of constant dampness and biting wind on open drakkars. An ordinary person would have contracted pneumonia before the ship even reached the shores of England. A berserker, however, could sleep on a wet deck in the pouring rain without any ill effects. Their immune systems operated at a truly phenomenal level of efficiency. It is interesting how they learned to control the release of hormones into the bloodstream. A warrior did not enter a state of battle trance or berserker gang by accident. It was a biochemical storm within their own bodies that could be triggered at will. They used special breathing techniques to raise their heart rate to the limit before battle. This was often accompanied by rhythmic strikes of their weapon against their shield and a characteristic howl. In this way, they artificially induced hyperventilation of the lungs and a powerful surge of norepinephrine. For a long time, many historians believed that the secret of this fury lay in fly agaric mushrooms. This theory became incredibly popular in popular culture and literature. But let's apply some logic and look at this from a tactical perspective. A person under the influence of strong psychedelics cannot maintain formation or distinguish their own men. Drug intoxication makes a warrior unpredictable, but utterly useless in a coordinated attack. The reality is that their trance-like state was the result of self-hypnosis. Months of isolation and ritual practices created a powerful conditioned reflex in the brain. It was enough for a warrior to hear a certain drum beat or bite the edge of a shield. This trigger instantly activated the animal sub-personality created during their life in the forest. The brain itself produced internal opiates in such quantities that any mushrooms would seem like child's play. Modern psychiatry is familiar with such cases of dissociation, but the Vikings had perfected the process. This controlled psychosis made them incredibly effective as a breakthrough weapon. When a wall of shields clashed with another wall of shields, the battle often reached a stalemate. No one wanted to be the first to charge into the tips of spears and die for the Jarl. And that was when those for whom death seemed a trivial detail stepped forward. The Berserkers cut a breach in the enemy ranks, sowing absolute uncontrollable terror. The enemies looked at them and saw not men, but raging demons. A man without chainmail took blows from swords and kept advancing with a mad grin. The psychological effect of such a spectacle broke the enemy's fighting spirit faster than axes. Roman infantry would have defeated them through iron discipline and the rotation of ranks, but the untrained militiamen of the early Middle Ages simply dropped their weapons and fled in panic. I would have run too, and you would most likely have done the same. But sheer determination isn't enough to swing a heavy axe for hours on end. Your muscles burn out from lactic acid very quickly, even if you think you're a bear. The northern masters of war needed to instill superhuman endurance in their fighters. To do this, they used a method now known as the principle of progressive overload. Instead of barbells, they used logs, stones, and grueling workouts with overloaded weapons. Future berserkers trained with weapons that were twice as heavy as their combat ones. You take an iron-tipped club and practice striking a wooden post 1,000 times. Your arms refuse to obey, your back is on fire, and your joints creak under the incredible strain. But the instructors stood nearby and wouldn't let you stop for a second. Modern fitness trainers would call this the most brutal overtraining and a violation of all recovery guidelines. However, it was precisely this that forced the body to build additional muscle fibers and a capillary network. After months of such torment, a real battle axe felt as light as a feather. In battle, a berserker could deliver lightning-fast, crushing blows one after another without pause. The enemy simply couldn't physically raise their heavy shields in time to defend themselves. Simply, the endurance of these men amazed their contemporaries even more than their legendary fury. They resembled machines that never needed to stop to recharge. Another important part of their training was practicing their balance and coordination. Fighting on the deck of a rocking ship is very different from fighting on solid ground. Warriors learned to balance on narrow logs thrown across turbulent river currents. One wrong move, and you'd plunge into the icy water, breaking your bones on the rocks. This practice forced the nervous system to process information about the body's position in space at incredible speed. In battle, this gave them the ability to dodge blows on a purely instinctive level. Their technique for wielding large axes, known as brodexes, is also fascinating. This two-handed weapon required immense physical strength and perfect timing. One misstep, and you're completely exposed to an enemy spear or short sword. That's why the Berserkers honed every movement to the point of complete, unconscious automatism. Their muscle memory was so finely tuned that they fought literally on autopilot. And here, we return once again to the phenomenon of their battle trance. When consciousness shuts down, the body is completely controlled by ingrained reflexes. If you've struck a post 10,000 times, your hand will find the correct trajectory on its own. The trance eliminated doubt, fear of making a mistake, and the delay between decision and action. A warrior reacted to a threat in milliseconds, outpacing any conscious thought of the opponent. Modern neurophysiologists call this a state of flow, but the Vikings took it to the absolute extreme. The diet of these warriors also deserves a separate, very detailed mention. They ate mainly dried meat, fish, and huge amounts of animal fat. Such a high-fat diet gave them sustained energy for prolonged physical exertion. Carbohydrates were critically scarce, forcing the body to remain in a constant state of ketosis. Today, this is a trendy diet for weight loss, but back then, it was the only way to avoid dying of starvation. Ketosis makes the brain more focused, and the body's energy reserves nearly inexhaustible. The Romans relied on complex carbohydrates and wheat for the sustained endurance of their legions. The Northerners, however, built their military machine on fats and proteins, gaining explosive power. Both systems worked perfectly for their specific geographical and tactical conditions. The only difference was that after a march, a Roman legionary set up camp, while a Viking hauled his ship ashore. Both required the stamina of a horse and an iron will. By the way, hauling a drakkar ashore was a separate form of team physical training. The ship weighed several tons, and it had to be dragged over logs by hand. This exercise fantastically developed the back, legs, and a sense of synchronized teamwork. A lone berserker, no matter how strong he might be, would not have been able to move the ship an inch. Therefore, despite their wild temperament, they were firmly integrated into the structure of their unit. The myth of lone, uncontrollable maniacs shatters against the harsh reality of sea voyages. In the confined space of a ship, an unstable person is simply dangerous to the entire crew. If the Berserkers had attacked their own, they would have been thrown overboard on the second day of the voyage. Their fury was like a trigger. It was activated strictly on command. And this makes their training even more terrifying and complex than we are accustomed to thinking. It is not a lack of control, but its highest, most perverted form. The word berserk literally translates as bear skin or warrior in a bear shirt. The very act of wearing the skin of a slain mighty predator was a crucial element of their mystical war cult. It was far from merely warm clothing or a banal attempt to look more fearsome in the face of the enemy. By donning the heavy skin, the northern warrior physically and psychologically took on the brutal persona of the beast. In modern behavioral science, this complex trick is called an anchored anchor or embodied cognition. The ritual of changing clothes became an insurmountable boundary between the world of ordinary people and the world of bloodthirsty spirits. The process of obtaining this pelt also held immense sacred significance for the future super soldier of the North. The young man had to track down and defeat a massive bear without using heavy protective gear. Only in this way could he prove to the spirits of the forest his full right to wear this sacred animal mantle. The blood of the vanquished predator symbolically transferred all its primal fury and superhuman strength to the victor. This rite of passage forever altered the young man's consciousness, ruthlessly severing him from his former peaceful life. From that fateful moment on, he ceased to be merely a farmer's son and became a blind instrument of the gods. You've surely noticed that you behave completely differently in a formal business suit than in your pajamas at home. Our everyday clothing dictates certain rigid patterns of behavior to our brain and completely changes our sense of self. Now just imagine that your uniform is the blood-stained hide of a huge beast, skinned with your own hands. When the Berserker threw it over his broad shoulders, his brain received a powerful signal for immediate transformation. All familiar human emotions rapidly receded, replaced by the dull, primal instincts of a ruthless killer. It was a kind of mental switch that instantly triggered a chemical storm in the body of an experienced warrior. In addition to ferocious bears, wolf skins were immensely popular. Warriors who wore such fearsome garments were called ulfidnar, which translates to wolf-skinned. These fearless fighters were considered elite servants of Odin, the supreme Norse god. They differed radically from bears in their unique and incredibly coordinated pack tactics for waging brutal combat. Wolves never acted alone, preferring to operate as a single, deadly, living mechanism. Their mental connection with one another on the battlefield was almost supernatural. While bears broke through enemy lines with sheer brute force, the wolves acted more cunningly and far more swiftly. They would launch surprise attacks from the most vulnerable flanks, tear the disoriented enemy to pieces, and instantly retreat to cover. Their incredible coordination in bloody combat was truly astonishing, despite their state of deep trance. The Ulfidnar emitted a terrifying, guttural howl that paralyzed the will of an inexperienced opponent even before the first sword strike. This sonic terror was no less effective a psychological weapon than the sharpened steel of their heavy axes. Fear broke the enemy's ranks far more effectively than any wooden battering ram. Modern professional athletes are well acquainted with this dangerous effect of overheating during peak physical exertion. Marathon runners constantly douse themselves with cold water, while the rugged Vikings simply went into bloody battle wearing nothing but their pants. This is yet another stunning example of how ancient people intuitively solved incredibly complex physiological problems. They had absolutely no need for modern medical laboratories to understand how the human body functions under extreme stress. Natural selection on the muddy battlefield very quickly weeded out those who made the wrong tactical decisions. Make a mistake with your gear, and you'd instantly get a sharp spear in the chest, and your genes would leave this world forever. It is extremely interesting to consider how the rest of Viking society viewed these bloodthirsty berserkers during the rare periods of peace. In ancient Scandinavian sagas, they are very often described as extremely dangerous, unsociable, and unpleasant people to be around. This is hardly surprising, since a person with a completely shattered psyche fits very poorly into a peaceful domestic life. Their mad antics were tolerated solely because of their incredible usefulness during large-scale military campaigns. They were like living weapons of mass destruction, which people tried to keep firmly locked away until the right moment. Neighbors always prudently gave their homes a wide berth, fearing sudden outbursts of unprovoked rage. Mighty kings and wealthy jarls often kept entire squads of berserkers as their personal elite guard. Possessing a dozen such ferocious warriors was considered an unquestionable sign of a ruler's highest status and boundless wealth. However, outside of major wars, this idle guard could easily begin terrorizing the local civilian population with impunity. They constantly ran into serious trouble with the law due to outbursts of uncontrollable aggression in drunken harbor taverns. Society deeply respected their brute strength, but frankly feared their absolute, brutal unpredictability. It was an exorbitant price to pay for the fact that the fighters had forever sacrificed their humanity for the sake of martial prowess. This is a truly excellent example of how rapidly social standards change as historical eras shift. What made you an untouchable elite of society just yesterday could easily send you to the gallows tomorrow. The Berserkers hadn't grown any weaker physically. It was simply that the world around them had radically changed the fundamental rules of the game. They had become an archaic and terrifying relic of a savage past, for which there was absolutely no place in the civilized new kingdoms. The centralized state apparatus proved far stronger than any individual warrior, even the most ferocious and fearless. However, their unique methods of rigorous psychological training still inspire genuine admiration among modern military experts. Their incredible story clearly demonstrates that the human body is capable of absolute miracles of profound adaptation to stress. They were able to successfully hack their own biology thousands of years before the advent of modern cutting-edge neuroscience. Of course, the ultimate price of such psychological hacking was horrific, but the result forever changed the course of European history. Now let's take a closer look at the biochemistry of their rage and find out exactly what happened to their bodies after the battle. The release of colossal doses of adrenaline on such terrifying scales never leaves the human body without a trace. When the exhausted berserker emerged from his bloody trance, his body inevitably experienced the most severe physiological crash. In ancient Scandinavian sagas, this severe condition is very accurately described as weakness after rage. A warrior could lie motionless for hours in complete prostration on the cold ground, lacking the strength even to move. His heart, overloaded nervous system, and torn muscles urgently demanded the immediate repayment of a massive energy debt. During these long, agonizing minutes, the invincible, bloodthirsty giant became weaker than a small child. Modern sports medicine calls this frightening condition severe exhaustion of the adrenal glands and the entire central nervous system. You absolutely cannot constantly operate at the peak RPMs of a race car engine and expect fuel consumption like that of a small displacement car. During the fierce battle, his body completely burned through all its stored glycogen reserves, and his muscles sustained multiple painful micro-traumas. His hormone levels plummeted, and in place of his burning aggression came a deep, almost clinical apathy. The fierce warrior's eyes would go blank, and his mind would plunge into the dark, saving void of complete nothingness. It was precisely because of this critical vulnerability after battle that berserkers never fought alone without the reliable support of ordinary warriors. Ordinary, disciplined infantrymen with large wooden shields carefully protected these super soldiers while they painfully came to their senses. This incredibly effective symbiotic tactic made the entire Viking army incredibly flexible and deadly in any battle. The heavy infantry held the line like a solid wall of iron, while the frenzied berserkers functioned as precision armor-piercing projectiles. This brilliant combination of military discipline and controlled chaos shattered the defensive formations of the European armies of the time. Once a living, armor-piercing projectile had fully fulfilled its purpose, it was very carefully and quickly withdrawn deep into the rear. Comrades in arms gave the exhausted giants water to drink, covered them with warm furs, and vigilantly guarded their helpless sleep. It sounds rather cynical, but in a brutal war, mathematical efficiency is always prioritized far above beautiful, romantic legends. The northern commanders guarded their main striking force like the apple of their eye, not risking them in senseless and minor skirmishes. Each such fighter was worth a dozen ordinary militiamen, so they were saved for the very decisive turning point of the battle. Due to such regular and extreme physical strain, the lifespan of these outstanding fighters was extremely short. Even if a lucky berserker miraculously survived an enemy sword, his heart often simply could not withstand the strain. constant sharp spikes in blood pressure and monstrous hormonal surges completely wore out the heart muscle by the age of 30. Today, many professional athletes are forced to end their active careers at the same age for exactly the same medical reasons. The human body's capacity always has its strict biological limits, no matter how loudly or fiercely you scream. You may be able to temporarily deceive your animal fear, but you certainly cannot deceive your own genetics and cardiology. Nevertheless, this very short and dangerous life was filled to the brim with resounding glory, immense wealth, and universal fear. For a rugged man of the 8th century, living an incredibly vivid 30 years was far more prestigious than a dreary and long old age. Dying of a debilitating illness in one's own warm bed was generally considered the greatest disgrace for any northern warrior. The Berserkers, however, with their mad and bloody feats, guaranteed themselves a ticket to the bright halls of Valhalla. Their ironclad motivation was built on a profound religious belief that a heroic death is merely a glorious beginning of the journey. It is extremely interesting to compare their archaic methods with the training of modern elite military units in our high-tech world. Today, Special Forces soldiers are also actively taught to strictly control their fear and operate under conditions of extreme psychological stress. But modern science focuses primarily on maintaining absolute composure and maximum awareness in any emergency situation. The ancient Berserkers, on the other hand, went in a completely and radically opposite direction, toward uncontrolled madness and primal fury. Both of these methods are logically aimed at a single goal: to enable a living person to eliminate any threats as effectively as possible. The key difference lies solely in the fact that the modern fighter always remains a thinking human being, while the Viking consciously became a wild beast. A Special Forces operative must be able to instantly assess a complex situation, rescue hostages, and make the most precise tactical decisions. A warrior in a bearskin saw only a red haze of rage before him and a single simple goal: to destroy all living things. Our modern world has become much more complex, and simply swinging a huge axe furiously is no longer enough for global victory. Intelligence and precise calculation have definitively and irrevocably triumphed over brute animal strength on all modern battlefields. Although, if we think about it a little more deeply, we still use certain elements of their training incredibly actively to this day. Certain loud battle cries, aggressive heavy music before important competitions, athletes' ritualistic, intimidating dances. All of this is an echo of the past. We still instinctively try to awaken that very inner ferocious beast when we critically need an extra burst of explosive energy. Only now we do it in the completely safe and controlled environment of large stadiums or comfortable urban fitness clubs. We no longer need to hack through a bloody wall of enemy shields for a piece of fertile land to ensure our family's survival. Despite their historical disappearance, the Berserkers left a truly enormous mark on European history and world culture. Their very terrifying existence forced many other peoples to radically rethink their outdated views on defensive warfare. To successfully halt an advancing army that included such frenzied warriors, iron discipline and entirely new tactics were required. In many ways, it was precisely the panic-stricken fear of the Norse that greatly spurred the development of heavy knightly cavalry and the construction of tall stone castles. The impossibility of defeating these madmen in open fields forced Europeans to build impregnable fortress walls en masse. Thus, the wild and uncontrollable fury of the harsh North quite unwittingly set off a new, powerful wave of military engineering on the continent. Blacksmiths began forging thicker plate armor that even the heaviest berserker battle axe could not cut through. Architects devised deep moats and cunning traps simply to keep these frenzied warriors from reaching the city's wooden gates. The evolution of weapons always moves inexorably in a spiral where the perfect attack gives rise to an even more perfect defense. Europe was forced to grow wise very quickly and unite so as not to become easy prey for men in animal skins. Analyzing their bloody path, as an artificial intelligence, I can only observe the incredible cost of historical greatness. No resounding historical legend is ever born from the comforts of home, a warm blanket, and regular hearty meals. Behind every great and invincible warrior of antiquity inevitably lies the harshest of schools, completely beyond the comprehension of the modern city dweller. Reading about their grueling morning training marches, any modern person is sure to feel a sharp phantom pain in their legs, and their astonishing ability to endure the freezing cold will make people genuinely ashamed of their complaints about a poorly functioning office air conditioner. The Romans built great stone roads, and the Vikings forged steel from living men that cut through entire kingdoms. The nature of the trance dictated that Berserkers choose a very specific and deadly arsenal. Using a complex sword with a delicate balance in a state of primal rage is extremely ineffective. A sword requires fencing skills, an assessment of distance, and a cold calculation of the opponent's vulnerable spots. An axe, on the other hand, operates on the principle of raw kinetic energy multiplied by the force of the swing. This is precisely why the two-handed Scandinavian axe became the hallmark of these elite madmen. The biomechanics of striking with such an axe differ radically from those of a short blade. The warrior put his entire body weight into the swing, initiating the movement from the very tips of his feet. The blow traveled in a wide arc, gaining monstrous speed and piercing any defense. Wooden shields shattered into splinters, and chainmail links dug right into the flesh. It was physically impossible to block such a blow. The only option was to dodge. And not everyone could dodge a man moving with animal-like speed. Moreover, the axe was perfectly suited for breaking the enemy's shield wall. A berserker could hook the upper edge of a shield with the edge of the blade and yank it downward. This instantly exposed the enemy to a spear thrust from a comrade standing behind. This proves once again that they acted tactically, rather than simply swinging their weapons around. Their fury had a clear, practical purpose honed by years of training. Their ability to ignore the weight of their own massive weapons deserves special mention. The Brodex wasn't as heavy as it's portrayed in movies, but it required tremendous stamina. Swinging even a 2-kilogram axe with outstretched arms is a task fit for a weightlifter. In a trance-like state, the nervous system disabled the safety mechanisms that protect our muscles from tearing. A berserker utilized 100% of their muscle fibers, whereas an ordinary person uses barely half. This gave them that very bear-like strength that their enemies whispered about in terror. But this superpower had a dark side, which we have already mentioned. Disabling the muscle inhibitors meant that they were literally tearing their own ligaments. After a grueling battle, a warrior might find that his joints were seriously damaged. But in the heat of battle, endorphins and adrenaline completely masked these injuries. Modern powerlifters sometimes experience something similar during competitions, but they head straight to the hospital. Interestingly, many berserkers use their shields not for defense, but for attack. They would strike with the edge of the umbo directly into the face, turning a piece of wood into a shattering weapon. The famous shield gnawing before battle had not only an intimidating but also a practical effect. By biting the wood, they massaged the trigeminal nerve, which helped them enter a battle trance more quickly. It sounds wild, but from an anatomical standpoint, it's an excellent way to trigger an adrenaline rush. They were brilliant, albeit brutal, practitioners of applied neuroscience. Their weapons were often decorated with runes and special symbols dedicated to the god Odin. This served as an additional psychological anchor, reinforcing their belief in their own invincibility. If you believe that the god of war himself guides your acts, all doubt vanishes. There was no place for pacifism in the Viking religion, so their gods demanded blood. And the Berserkers were the most zealous and devoted priests of this bloody cult. It is difficult for modern people to understand this blend of religion, brutality, and supreme skill. We are accustomed to separating spirituality and violence, but for the Norse, they were one and the same. The blacksmith forging the axe and the warrior splitting skulls with it were performing a single sacred act. Their world was simple, brutal, and incredibly honest in its bloody logic. You were either a predator or you quickly became someone's prey on the battlefield. The Berserkers simply chose to be the most fearsome predators in this brutal forest. This approach made them completely impervious to psychological pressure from the enemy. It is physically impossible to intimidate someone who is the embodiment of pure, primal terror. When the Frankish army banged their swords against their shields, trying to frighten the Norse, the Berserkers merely laughed. To them, this noise was simply an invitation to a long-awaited bloody dance. They viewed war not as a tragedy, but as their natural, beloved habitat. Ultimately, their weapons and their psyche merged into a single deadly mechanism. They didn't just hold an axe. They themselves became an extension of that crude piece of iron. No other culture was able to create such an effective close combat machine. Yes, they lost out to the passage of time and Christian morality, vanishing into the mists of history. But their training methods remain one of the most terrifying examples of human potential. And to be honest, it truly boggles the imagination. Icelandic sagas have left us with many vivid descriptions of these incredible and terrifying warriors. They often state that berserkers were immune to fire and could not be cut by iron. Naturally, modern science views such claims with a great deal of skepticism. Human skin burns and flesh cuts easily, no matter how much adrenaline is in the blood. Most likely, this is poetic hyperbole, describing their absolute indifference to the wounds they sustained. Nevertheless, this myth of invulnerability worked in their favor in psychological warfare. Rumors of squads of immortal bear men spread ahead of the Viking fleet, sowing panic. Many settlements surrendered without a fight simply because they did not want to face them. In the modern world, this is called an information and psychological operation, or simply propaganda. The Vikings didn't have the internet, but they were masters at creating viral, terrifying news. Internet fear was their most reliable ally long before any actual physical battle began. It's interesting to see how the image of the Berserker has transformed in modern pop culture and literature. Today, they appear in video games, movies, and comics as caricatured, dim-witted brutes. They're given horned helmets that never existed and made to growl at the camera. This simplified image completely erases the colossal effort that went into their training. A real berserker was an elite professional, not just a screaming man with a club. Fortunately, modern archaeology and the study of historical texts are helping to restore historical justice. We are beginning to understand just how complex Viking society and their military art were. They possessed deep knowledge of anatomy, psychology, and group dynamics. Their blacksmiths crafted magnificent weapons, and their training methods were centuries ahead of their time. Studying the Berserkers allows us to view humans as incredibly adaptive biological machines. This is frightening, but at the same time inspires immense, genuine respect for our rugged ancestors. Some researchers are even attempting to reconstruct their training in modern sports camps. People voluntarily go into the woods, starve themselves, and subject themselves to extreme physical exertion. Of course, No one is forcing them to kill bears or drink water with vinegar. But the very fact that we seek strength in their ancient practices is quite telling. We lack that primal energy that they knew so skillfully how to control. We live in an age of absolute comfort, where a dead smartphone battery is the main problem. Our bodies have gone soft in office chairs, and our nervous systems break down at the slightest stress. Against the backdrop of this pampered world, berserkers seem like visitors from another, harsher planet. Their ability to endure pain and deprivation looks like a forgotten superpower of the human race. Perhaps that is why we read about them so spellbound and make movies about them. They remind us of the beast that sleeps deep within each of us. But it is important to remember that the path of the berserker is one of destruction, not creation. Society cannot consist solely of warriors in a permanent state of battle frenzy. Someone has to sow the grain, build ships, and raise the next generation of children. Berserkers were a tool, a hammer in the hands of history, which shattered the old borders of states. Once those borders were established, the need for this heavy, blood-stained hammer simply vanished. Their disappearance was as inevitable as the decline of the entire glorious Viking age. Scandinavia adopted Christianity, kings consolidated their power, and wars became more professional. The place of fur-clad madmen was taken by steel-clad knights with codes of honor. The era of wild, unbridled fury gave way to an era of tactics, sieges, and complex political alliances. But the memory of those fearless men has been forever etched into the European genetic code, and even 1,000 years later, their name evokes in us a mixture of admiration and awe. As we conclude this detailed analysis, I'd like to ask you one simple but important question. Could a modern person endure even a tenth of that terrifying training? Could we survive in the forest in winter, break our own minds, and become living weapons? Most of us would break down in the very first week of this Scandinavian hell, and that is actually excellent news, indicating that the world has become more humane. We no longer need to turn ourselves into monsters to protect our homes and families. We can admire their endurance, study their neurobiology, and laugh at their diet. But we should be grateful that we don't have to stand in a wall of shields. Their story is a magnificent example of how far a person can go for the sake of victory. It is a triumph of will over the body that will forever remain in the annals of world military history. Thank you for watching until this point. It only gets more interesting from here. The Viking Age has left us with many mysteries that science continues to unravel to this day. The Berserkers turned out not to be mythical monsters, but brilliantly trained fighters with incredible physical capabilities. Their strength lay not in magic, but in the harshest discipline and the absolute overcoming of themselves. They proved that the human body is capable of enduring what seems impossible to the average person. This knowledge forever changes our understanding of the limits of the human nervous system's endurance. The next time you go to the gym and get tired on the treadmill, just think of these guys. And you go think of the people who ran into battle naked, smiling in the face of death. Maybe that will give you a little strength to finish your workout without complaining. History isn't just boring dates, it's the experiences of those who lived on the edge. Study the past because it holds secrets that the modern world has long forgotten. See you again on our channel.